This is a SpaceX Starship. It's the largest object ever launched into space, and it's also in the process of burning up in the Earth's atmosphere. You are seeing the inside of a screaming hot plasma cloud with enough thermal energy to melt steel, which is exactly what it's doing. Now, the fact alone that something this big and heavy actually made it high enough into outer space for this event to even happen, that is an impossible feat. But the additional fact that we are able to watch this all happen live on the internet in reasonably good video quality, that's something else altogether. Let's establish a little progression here. This is a SpaceX Falcon 9 mission from April 2020, not that long ago, and at the time, this was the high water mark for live streaming from space. Not only did you get to watch the rocket launch and fly into orbit, but you also got to watch the booster come back down and land on a drone ship. Well, mostly at least. Typically around this era, the live stream would cut out as the booster was re-entering Earth's atmosphere, and then the feed would switch over to this potato vision live view from the landing platform that was basically just good enough to confirm the rocket landed safely and didn't blow up. Now this is another Falcon 9 mission, this time from July 2023, and we've got a significant improvement here. Not just in video resolution, but now we can watch the booster fall all the way back to Earth, uninterrupted, and the view from the landing pad is light years ahead in terms of quality. Now fast forward one more time, and we are at the third test flight of the SpaceX Starship in March 2024, and not only is the video resolution and quality even better than ever, we also see something happen that has literally never before been seen on video. The Starship re-enters Earth's atmosphere from an orbital velocity of around 27,000 kilometers per hour. This is the biggest object ever launched into space at 50 meters long and 9 meters wide with a mass of over 100 metric tons. There was no shortage of people who were highly skeptical that a rocket of this size could ever successfully make it into orbit. The closest that anyone had ever come was an old Soviet rocket from the late 1960s called the N-1. They tried to launch this thing 4 times, and on every attempt, the rocket exploded, including one event where it fell straight back down after just a few seconds of flight and triggered the largest man-made non-nuclear explosion in history. And Starship did not exactly get off to a great start itself. The first test flight started off with blasting a giant crater where the launch pad used to be, and then the rocket essentially tore itself apart as it flew through the air, before eventually losing all control and just spinning helplessly through the air before it mercifully exploded. This all improved greatly on the second test flight, where the vehicle actually made it to stage separation and the ship managed to fly into space for a little while until it all exploded, which unfortunately we were only able to see through a telephoto lens on the ground. There was no live stream from space. But now we get back to test flight number 3. Not only is Starship broadcasting live from 200 kilometers above the Earth, it's also continuing that stream all the way down into the Earth's atmosphere. And that is where things get nuts. So we have an exceptionally massive object moving at incredible speed through the vacuum of space. That's fine, but as the environment starts to transition from vacuum to atmosphere, the vehicle starts to impact solid molecules. Even though the air is super thin up at this altitude of around 100 kilometers, the ship is carrying enough energy to violently compress all of the gases that it's flying through, and when you compress a gas, you increase its temperature. When you increase the temperature of a gas high enough, like by compressing it with a giant hypersonic rocket ship, it will actually change state into something called plasma. This is the stuff that's inside the sun. It's as energized as physical matter can possibly get, and in its final moments of life, our Starship was engulfed by a cloud of these supercharged particles. Now, this same process happens to everything that attempts to enter Earth's atmosphere. Rocks, space junk, and vehicles like the Dragon capsule, the Soyuz capsule, and the old space shuttle, but we never actually got to see it happen before Starship Flight 3. So, what changed? We've had satellite internet for a pretty long time now. The first commercial internet satellite went up in 1996, and the first consumer satellite internet service launched in 2003, but even up to the modern era, the majority of satellite internet has been really, really bad, like the kind of thing that you would only ever want to use if you had no other options. And the reason for that has very little to do with technology and almost everything to do with economics. We need to talk about orbits. An orbit is essentially just moving really fast in a circular pattern around a gravity well. The giant ball of iron in the center of the Earth creates a divot in the fabric of space that wants to pull matter into it. Now, matter can avoid falling into that gravity well by moving very fast. It's like a bowl in a skate park. If a rider carries enough speed into the bowl, they can ride around the rim without ending up in the bottom. We kind of do the same thing when we orbit the Earth. The lower your orbit, the faster you have to move in order to stay out of the gravity well, while at a higher altitude, the pull of gravity is diminished, and you can get away with moving more slowly. Now, why is this important? Well, different kinds of satellites operate at different altitudes in Earth orbit, and this is going to have a significant effect on how they perform. For example, the higher up you position a communication satellite, the longer the delay time is going to be from sending the signal off the ground to the satellite and then back down to the ground. This is called latency. So, in theory, a communication satellite would perform better at a lower altitude to reduce the latency. But the downside of this is that at a low Earth orbit, say 500 kilometers, that satellite can only see a relatively small portion of the Earth. It's not far enough away to get a wide field of view, and as the satellite is moving in its orbit and the Earth is moving in its rotation, the satellite will never be able to maintain a line of sight with any particular location on the ground, making it very difficult to maintain communication. You would need a whole lot of satellites in operation and a ground system that was smart enough to constantly switch its transmission to always hit the nearest satellite. This is all very complicated and, in this case more importantly, expensive, so therefore it was not the method adopted by most satellite communications providers. Instead, the majority of our communication satellites have been placed into a much, much higher orbit called geosynchronous. This phenomenon occurs at an altitude just over 35,000 kilometers above the Earth around the equator region. And from up here, a satellite can actually travel at the exact same speed as the Earth's rotation. They move in sync, hence the name. So these high-altitude satellites can each see a very large area of the Earth's surface, and they always see the same area all the time. If you've ever had satellite TV installed, the technician comes to your house and they position your satellite dish. They're aiming it at one of these satellites, and that's where your TV comes from and why the dish only needs to be positioned one time. Back in the olden days of the 70s and 80s, there used to be these gigantic satellite dishes in people's yards. There were a lot fewer satellites in orbit back then, and they had less capability, so the dishes needed to be much bigger, and they actually had to move around to find different satellites that were broadcasting different channels. It was really cool because you could pick up any analog video feed from any satellite as long as you could point your dish at it. Anyway, the system was fine for TV, but it kind of sucks for the internet because you want to interact with the internet. You send and receive signals from all kinds of different addresses, so higher latency translates into a much less enjoyable experience. But the only way to fix it would be to deploy a lot more satellites into a much lower orbit and use receivers on the ground that can track moving satellites and cycle between them as they come and go from view. Who could possibly handle a project of that complexity? Well, SpaceX, of course. Most people have heard of Starlink. It's nothing new, but this is all about establishing the context for why Starlink is different and how it does things that no other satellite internet can do. The average Starlink orbit is right around 550 kilometers above the Earth. Remember, our traditional geosynchronous satellites are up at 35,000. The difference is incredible, and that's reflected in a significantly lower latency for Starlink internet when compared to any conventional satellite internet. Coupled with much faster upload and download speeds, there's almost no noticeable difference between Starlink internet and our typical ground-based internet used by the majority of people for all of their online connectivity. In order to achieve this, SpaceX has to use a lot of satellites, like a lot. There are nearly 6,000 operational Starlink satellites, Hundreds more have been launched and already taken out of service, and those satellites are all moving at a speed of over 27,000 kilometers per hour to maintain their relatively low orbit. Each satellite will circle the entire globe once every 90 minutes. So these things are whipping by just overhead. How do we maintain a signal with them? Well, this is where the Starlink antenna comes into play. This thing is not a traditional satellite dish like the one you use for TV. The Starlink dish is a beast. Without getting into anything way too technical, the Starlink antenna has an internal system called a phase array. This allows it to track signals from moving satellites and rapidly switch between different satellite signals. The dish does not need to be physically moved to accomplish this. The dish does have a motorized positioning system, but this is only to make it easier to point at open sky. Once the angle is set, the dish won't have to move again. The density of Starlink satellites is now high enough that there will always be one visible from nearly every location on Earth as long as you have an unobstructed view of the sky. Now, returning to the Starship one last time. If you look at the nose cone of the vehicle, you can see 4 black rectangles. These are Starlink antennas, pretty much the same thing that you can buy and use at your own home, but with a black heat-resistant material covering them to protect against the insane heat of re-entry. This is how the Starship was able to live stream its journey from space. Using the phased array system, each one of those antennae can angle their transmission to try and hit the nearest Starlink satellite, which in this case is not very far away. The Starship is traveling over a wide range of different velocities and altitudes that take it as high as around 230 kilometers, so nearly halfway to Starlink orbit. So we've got a very fast-moving Starship trying to connect with some very fast-moving satellites that are all extremely close by satellite standards. There's also one additional complication that probably wasn't anticipated. Beginning shortly after main engine cutoff, the Starship actually begins to roll around as it floats through space. Presumably, it was supposed to fly in a relatively straight line with the nose pointed forward and the heat shield pointed down towards the Earth, but that was not the case. So the ship is just kind of lazily flipping and rolling around, and it's still doing this as it begins to re-enter the atmosphere, which is bad for a lot of reasons. But either way, those 4 black antennas that were supposed to be pointing up through this maneuver are just kind of spinning around, but they're still managing to keep a steady connection to the network. You can almost imagine these 4 beams of radio signal actively moving around and reaching out to connect with whatever Starlink satellites they can see from any given angle that the ship is pointing, which is impressive on its own. But now the plasma is starting to build up on the outside of the ship. That red cloud of screaming hot charged particles can bring the surface temperature of the heat shield up to 1400 degrees Celsius or 2700 degrees Fahrenheit. Except because of this uncontrolled rolling motion of the ship, that plasma is not being contained by the heat shield. The ship is kind of rotating like a Swiss chalet chicken. It's getting cooked from all sides. Fortunately, the bulk of the heat is concentrating at the base of the vehicle. The engines are getting roasted, but the Starlink array is relatively safe, which is allowing us to continue watching the ship burn up and melt as it falls deeper into the atmosphere. It's visually stunning to look at, and it's something that no one has ever really seen before, and that's largely because without SpaceX and without a satellite network like Starlink, this kind of thing would not be possible.